Recently, I found myself immersed in one of my favorite historical strategy games, Total War Attila. Released in 2014, it places you in command of an empire during late antiquity, a time teetering on the brink of chaos. Unlike other Total War games where you build mighty empires, this one challenges you to hold your fractured realm together. Famines, plagues and relentless enemies, both foreign invaders and internal dissent, test your resolve at every turn. While I played, a question lingered in my mind. What was it like to live through a world unraveling around you? History has witnessed the demise of countless civilizations. Cultures that once built awe-inspiring monuments, composed epic poetry, and shaped the very foundations of modern language and thought. Yet, many of these societies vanished, leaving behind ruins and mysteries. These were the so-called Dark Ages, periods marked by the collapse of central authority, economic disarray, the fall of elite classes, plummeting population, and the fading of literacy and knowledge. Dark Ages aren't confined to any one part of the world, they've occurred across the globe. Take the Maya for example. When Spanish missionaries first stumbled upon the overgrown ruins of their once grand cities in the Guatemalan jungle, they couldn't believe that these masterpieces had been built by the humble villagers living nearby. The days of great Maya city-states, with their towering temples and powerful rulers, were long gone. So far removed that the Maya of the time seemed indifferent to the glory of their ancestors. But how did it feel to witness such a decline firsthand? To live through the moments when everything began to fall apart? To explore this question, let's examine two pivotal collapses in history. The Bronze Age collapse around 1200 BC and the fall of the Western Roman Empire. Both plunged the world into dark ages as we know them. But before diving in, we must first ask ourselves, why do civilizations die? Entering a dark age is a slow process. It does not happen from one day to another. Rome was not built in one day, and it did not fall in one either. Total War greatly captures this reality. You don't lose the campaign because of one battle. Instead, you will become weaker and weaker while you lose ground and resources. But not much long ago, historians perceived the events in this way. They identified one event or series of events and proclaimed it as the reason why civilizations died. In the case of the collapse at the end of the Bronze Age, it were the mysterious sea people that appeared in the 12th century BC and are often referred to in texts of that time. In the case of the Roman Empire, it were the barbaric hordes that overran the Roman frontier and toppled the last Roman emperor, Romulus Augustus. Today we know that the real reason for these collapses were far more complex. In his book 1177 BC, The Year Civilization Collapsed, Eric H. Klein concludes that the Sea People were not the cause of the collapse of the Mycenaeans, Hittites and Egyptians. Rather, they were a symptom of it. You know, the Sea People were not the only explanation given by historians. Others proclaimed that the cause for the collapse of the Bronze Age civilizations were earthquakes, a drought or a plague. All of these are, to some extent, backed up by archaeological evidence. Megiddo, the biblical Armageddon for example, was destroyed at least twice by an earthquake during the Bronze and Iron Age. Researchers also used modern methods like the pollen analysis, which confirmed a dry period at the end of the Bronze Age. There is evidence that climate shifts may have contributed to the end of the Bronze Age. One study of the palace at Pylos concludes that a brief period of drier conditions around 3200 years BP may have disrupted the Mycenaean agricultural system, while increasing aridity in the years after the palace's destruction probably reduced crop yields and helped to erode the basis for the reinstitution of a central authority and the palace itself. On a larger scale, analysis of fossilized pollen grains concluded that the driest event throughout the Bronze Age and Iron Age occurred around 1250 to 1100 BC, followed by a dramatic recovery in the Iron One, which led to settlement recovery. Scholars David Kaniewski and Elise von Campo conducted their own pollen analysis and concluded the late Bronze Age crisis coincided with the onset of a circa 300-year drought event 3000 1200 years ago. Plagues too have long haunted civilizations, and the Bronze Age was no exception. In 1322 BC, the Hittite Empire was devastated by a massive plague, possibly a case of tularemia. The infamous Black Death, or Erisina pestis, which ravaged Europe centuries later, also made its mark in the Bronze Age. In 2018, researchers identified traces of this deadly plague in the remains of a man and a woman buried in southwest Russia around 1800 BC. These skeletons stand as haunting reminders of the ever-present threat of diseases in ancient times. However, plagues, invasions, earthquakes and droughts were not unique to this period. These hardships were routine realities for Bronze Age societies, who endured and recovered from them time and again. Early civilizations even incorporated such disasters into their beliefs. For instance, the Akkadians worshipped Era, a god of plague and destruction. Eric H. Klein in 1177 BC, the year civilizations collapsed, argues that the downfall of the Bronze Age empires was not caused by a single event, but by a perfect storm of challenges. Prolonged droughts and plagues left the once mighty societies too weakened to resist the migratory movements of the sea people. Yet these invaders weren't exactly foreign aggressors. They were displaced groups fleeing their own climate crisis in search of fertile lands, like the Nile Delta. Sometimes the real threat wasn't even external. Internal rebellions against rigid, centralized governments also contributed to the collapse of palace systems. By the end of the 12th century BC, the Hittite Empire, Mycenaeans and Egyptians had either fallen or entered a dark age. Others, like the Assyrians and Babylonians, managed to delay their declines, but faced significant recessions by the late 11th century. Similarly, the fall of the Roman Empire cannot be attributed to a single cause. It's a topic so complex that it has inspired entire libraries of study, including Edward Gibbon's monumental The History of the Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. Peter Turchin, in his book War, Peace and War, offers a compelling explanation. The Germanic tribes weren't the sole villains of the Western Empire's collapses. By the 5th century AD, Germanic people were deeply embedded within the empire, serving in its armies and contributing to its fabric. As Rome's borders expanded and its armies moved further away from the capital, recruitment increasingly relied on frontier regions rather than the central Roman lands. During Emperor Diocletian's rule, small farmers, the backbone of the legions for centuries, were even discouraged and outright banned from joining the military. This disconnect between Rome's heartland and its defensive forces signaled a deeper systematic vulnerability, making it clear that the empire's downfall was rooted in a combination of internal decay and external pressure. The collapse of great civilizations is rarely the result of one catastrophic event. Instead, it's the culmination of multiple factors converging to create an unstoppable wave of change. Indeed, in the beginning of the 1st century, Italians supplied 2/3 of recruits for the imperial legions. But by the end of the century, this proportion fell to below 1/4. Unfortunately, the measures taken by the authorities were completely ineffectual. During the 2nd and 3rd century AD, the proportion of legion recruits from Italy fell to just 3%. The Roman government was deeply intertwined with Germanic influence, with figures like the Vandal general Stilicho, who served as a magister militum in the late 4th century, playing pivotal roles in keeping the empire afloat. Even individuals often associated with the empire's fall, Arbogast, Alaric and Odoacer, held official Roman titles, blurring the lines between external invasion and internal conflict. This dynamic gives the fall of Rome a striking resemblance to a civil war. Historian Peter Turchin suggests that the empire's collapse was less a sudden catastrophe and more an agreement between Italy's wealthy landowners and the emerging Germanic elite to abandon the imperial framework. This perspective also sheds light on the reaction to Justinian's attempt to reclaim Italy. Roman senators often sided with the Ostrogoth regime, showing little support for a revived empire. Ultimately, the fall of Rome was a complex process shaped by multiple factors. One significant driver was climate change. Recent tree ring studies revealed a severe drought along the Danube frontier, which likely pushed the Huns to migrate westward in search of survival. In the end, the so-called fall of the Roman Empire wasn't a singular event, but a series of decisions, alliances, and environmental pressures that brought an era to its close. New climate data reconstructed from tree rings by Professor Bündgen and colleagues provided information about yearly changes in climate over the last 2000 years. It shows that Hungary experienced episodes of unusually dry summers in the 4th and 5th centuries. Hakenbeck and Bündgen point out that climatic fluctuations, in particular drought spells from 420 to 450 AD, would have reduced crop yields and pasture for animals beyond the floodplains of the Danube and Tisza. The severe drought along the Danube frontier forced the Huns to migrate westward, setting off a chain reaction that drove Germanic tribes into the Roman Empire in search of refuge and safety. But the Romans themselves are also to blame for their collapse. Starting in the 3rd century, Rome endured relentless civil wars. During the crisis of the 3rd century, 235 to 284 AD, the empire was ruled by an astonishing 26 emperors, many of whom met violent ends. Social inequality further eroded Rome's foundation. In the early days of the Republic, the Roman elite championed values like modesty and humility. By the later years, however, nearly all the land was concentrated in the hands of a wealthy few, who even restricted their tenants' ability to leave. The Roman dream, where a man could join the legions, earn land and build a future through service to his country, had long since vanished. By the time Odoacer deposed Romulus Augustus in 476 AD, the empire spirit had already withered away. This decline is vividly mirrored in Total War Attila. Victory rarely hinges on a single catastrophic event. You may fend off the Hunnic invaders, but what happens when your armies are ravaged by plague, weakened by starvation, or pulled back from the frontier to quell internal rebellions? The combined strain of these pressures will eventually bring your empire to its knees. Everything you've built will crumble into ruin, just as it did for Rome. From our modern perspective, events like these stand out as clear turning points in history. But how did the people of that time experience them? Before diving in, it's important to clarify something. Our view of the past is incredibly limited here. Due to the nature of Bronze Age society and the complexity of early writing systems, very few people could write. Primarily those serving temples or palaces. However, this limitation works to our advantage in this case, as it was the palace elite who were most directly impacted by the dramatic changes at the end of the Bronze Age. Like other Bronze Age civilizations, the Mycenaeans operated a highly centralized economy controlled by their palaces. They relied on a writing system known as Linear B, inscribed on clay tablets. Typically, these tablets weren't burned as they were intended for reuse once the information was no longer needed. Luckily for us, the tablets we've discovered were preserved, because they were unintentionally baked in fires that destroyed the palaces. For instance, the tablets of Pylos, famous as the home of Nestor, the wise elder of Homer's Iliad, were preserved when the palace was consumed in flames. The Linear B tablets tell a horrifying picture, one of desperation and agony. The enemy grabbed all the priests from everywhere and without reason murdered them secretly by simply drowning. I am calling out to my descendants for the sake of history. I am told that the northern strangers continued their terrible attack, terrorizing and plundering until a short time ago. I fell back in fear from the huge massacre afflicted on us during this nightmare of suffering. They decided then to burn our refuge and to beat us. All were dragged from the stable and done evil with hammer blows, this filthy deed. While remembering the terror, we had to recover from the defeat by gently giving very good care to the afflicted and performing surgery. The Northerners have started the work of burying in the forest after a nightmare of agony, during which they gored, destroyed and drowned mercilessly while robbing. When we were left alone, many were still shivering and frightened after this nightmare of agony. Clearly something horrible had happened. Other tablets speak of desperate measures to ensure that this would not happen again. be it sacrifices to the gods or mobilization of ships and men. To all the gods 1 amphora of honey, to the mistress of the labyrinth 1 amphora of honey. Thus the watchers are guarding the coasts. Command of Maleus at Uvitono, 50 men of Uvitono to go to Oikalia. Command of Netvatas, 20 men of Kyparsia at Aruvote, 10 Kyparisia men at Aitaleves. Command of Tros at Roava. Cadassio, a shareholder performing feudal service, 110 men from Oikalia to Aratuva. But it was all in vain. Around 1200 BC, the palace at Pylos was burned to the ground, marking the collapse of the centralized government that had dominated the Mycenaean world. These surviving texts are unique, as the Mycenaeans typically used Linear B solely for inventory records. Yet in this case, a terrified scribe felt compelled to document the catastrophe unfolding around them. After the palace's destruction, some individuals continued to inhabit its ruins. But this settlement was short-lived and soon abandoned entirely. Along with the fall of the palaces, the Greeks also lost their ability to write. Linear B was a highly complex writing system, and it didn't take long for it to be forgotten when scribes were no longer needed. Remarkably, Greek historians of the classical age, such as Herodotus, were aware that a profound change had occurred around 1200 BC. Herodotus speaks of a Dorian invasion that, according to him, followed shortly after the Trojan War. From the Hittites, however, we have yet to uncover records that foreshadow the impending collapse. This suggests that the fall of their empire may have been sudden and unforeseen. That said, there are signs of famine leading up to the downfall. Pharaoh Meneptah, for instance, recorded sending grain to keep the land of Hatti alive, and Assyrian sources also reference famine in Hatti. During this time, there were also indications of marauding bands. Amurapi, the last king of Ugarit, a vassal state of the Hittites, wrote a desperate plea to the king of Cyprus. "My father, behold, the enemy's ships came here, my cities were burned, and they did evil things in my country. Does not my father know that all my troops and chariots are in the land of Hatti, and all my ships are in the land of Lucca? Thus the country is abandoned to itself. May my father know it. The 7 ships of the enemy that came here inflicted much damage upon us." Not long after, Ugarit too fell to destruction. It's likely that pirates disrupted the vital food supply routes between Egypt and the Hittites, leading to rebellion or leaving the state vulnerable to foreign invaders. In a final, desperate attempt to save his empire, Suppiluliuma II launched an assault against these invaders. He recorded a victory and even briefly regained control over Cyprus, but it was ultimately futile. After this, the records fall silent. We don't know what became of the last ruler of the once mighty Hittite Empire. What we do know is that around 1200 BC, Hattusa, the Hittite capital, was destroyed and abandoned. The palace, vast sections of the city, and its fortifications were consumed by flames. Most evidence points to a foreign army as the likely cause of the city's fall. With the destruction of Hattusa, the Hittite Empire came to an end. Never again would the Hittites rise as a great power. However, some remnants endured. A few Hittite city-states and their dynasties, known as the Neo-Hittites, managed to survive, carrying forward fragments of their once great civilization. The clearest accounts of the chaos that marked the dawn of the 12th century BC come from Egyptian records. Both Pharaoh Meneptah and Ramses III confronted and defeated foreign invaders who threatened the Nile Delta. In 1208 BC, Libyan warbands joined forces with a coalition of Sea People tribes under the leadership of a man named Mervey and launched an invasion of the Delta. Interestingly, Egyptian records mention that warriors from a group called the Ekwesh were part of this Libyan alliance. Many historians have speculated that the Ekwesh might be the Egyptian name for the Mycenaeans, though this remains a topic of intense scholarly debate. Nearly 30 years later, Ramses III, who ruled Egypt from 1186 to 1155 BC, also faced the Sea People in 1175 BC. He fought a major battle in the Nile Delta and left behind a vivid and detailed account of the events at the Temple of Medinet Habu. These inscriptions provided invaluable insight into the struggle to defend Egypt during one of history's most turbulent eras. The foreign countries made a conspiracy in the islands. All at once, the lands were removed and scattered in the fray. No land could stand before their arms, from Kate, Kode, Kakemish, Atsava and Al-Shia on, being cut off at once. A camp was set up in one place in Amuru. They desolated its people, and its land was like that which has never come into being. They were coming forward toward Egypt, while the flames was prepared before them. Their confederation was the Pelest, Cheka, Shekelesh, Danuna and Weshesh lands united. They laid their hands upon the lands as far as the circuit of the earth, their hearts confident and trusting. Now it happened through this God, the Lord of gods, that I was prepared and armed to trap them like a wild fowl. He furnished my strength and caused my plans to prosper. I went forth, directing these marvelous things. I equipped my Frontier Sahi, prepared before them, the chiefs, the captains of infantry, the nobles. I caused to equip the river mouths like a strong wall, with warships, galleys and barges. They were manned completely from bow to stern, with valiant warriors bearing their arms, soldiers of all the choicest of Egypt, being like lions roaring upon the mountain tops. The charioteers were warriors, and all good officers ready of hand. Their horses were quivering in their every limb, ready to crush the countries under their feet. I was the valiant Montu, stationed before them, that they might behold the hand-to-hand fighting of my arms. I, King Ramses III, was made a fast-riding hero, conscious of his might, valiant to lead his army in the day of battle. Those who reached my boundary, their seed is not, their heart and their soul are finished forever and ever. As for those who had assembled before them on the sea, the full flame was in their front, before the river mouths, and a wall of metal upon the shore surrounded them. They were dragged, overturned, and laid low upon the beach, slain and made heaps from stern to bow of their galleys, while all their things were cast upon the water. Thus I turned back the waters to remember Egypt. When they mention my name in their land, may it consume them, while I sit upon the throne of Harakte, and the serpent diadem is fixed upon my head, like Re. I permit not the countries to see the boundaries of Egypt too among them. As for the 9 bows, I have taken away their land and their boundaries. They are added to mine. Their chiefs and their people come to me with praise. I carried out the plans of the All-Lord, the august, divine Father, Lord of the gods. Ramses III paints a dramatic, perhaps even apocalyptic picture of the Bronze Age collapse. In his inscriptions, he lists the land destroyed by the Sea People, illustrating the scale of their devastation. While he boasts of a great victory over these invaders, cracks in Egypt's strength are still evident. Why, for instance, did he allow the Sea People to settle on Egyptian land? This decision seems more like a compromise with the invader than a decisive triumph, though Ramses likely didn't want history to remember it that way. In the years that followed, Egypt slid into turmoil. Ramses III himself was assassinated in what can only be described as a dramatic coup. His successors struggled to maintain control, losing their influence over the Levante. Even the sanctity of the dead was no longer guaranteed. Royal tombs were plundered, forcing authorities to relocate the mummies to hidden graves, in a desperate attempt to protect them. Although Egypt endured, it would never again rise to the status of a great power. The shadows of the Bronze Age collapse marked the beginning of a long and steady decline. Even back in Roman times, there were clear signs that a collapse was looming. In the 5th century AD, a man named Priscus embarked on a journey to the camp of Attila the Hun, as part of an envoy sent by the Eastern Roman Emperor. Along the way, he painted a grim picture of the Roman frontier, describing a world on the brink, where decay and disorder had taken hold. When we arrived at Naissus, we found the city deserted. as though it had been sacked. Only a few sick persons lay in the churches. We halted at a short distance from the river in an open space, for all the ground adjacent to the bank was full of the bones of men slain in war. Prisco's accounts leave no doubt. By this point, Rome could no longer defend its borders against foreign invaders. His description of Nisus, the modern-day Nis in Serbia, is particularly striking. This was no ordinary city, it was the birthplace of Constantine the Great, the emperor who made Christianity the empire's official religion. Yet now it stood abandoned, a ghost town, a symbol of Rome's decline. His writings offer even more evidence of the empire's weakening grip. While drinking with the Huns, a Roman soldier made the mistake of suggesting that the Roman emperor ranked above Attila. Their reaction was furious. Gone were the days where Rome's rulers were seen as the supreme authority. Other kings now claimed equal standing, and to be fair, Rome had only itself to blame. Too many emperors had fallen at the hands of their own men. In the 3rd and 4th centuries, few died of old age, a grim tradition that would persist in the Eastern Roman Empire. As Rome unraveled, the Germanic tribes, especially the Goths, were finding new stability. They began electing their own kings, a stark contrast to Rome's chaos. This wasn't the first time a Germanic kingdom had risen. Earlier ones, like Marbots, had been short-lived, but this time was different. The Goths left behind records that paint a vivid picture of the turmoil of the 5th century, a time when one great power crumbled while others took its place. Attila united all the people under his own rule, gathering also a host of other tribes which he then held under his sway. He sought to subdue the foremost nations of the world, the Romans and the Visigoths. His army is said to have numbered 500,000 men. He was a man born into the world to shake the nations, the scourge of our lands, who in some way terrified all mankind by the dreadful rumors noised abroad concerning him. This image of Attila as a divine scourge, sent by God to bring destruction, became deeply ingrained in the collective memory of Western civilization. Even centuries later, during World War I, British and American soldiers commonly referred to the Germans as Huns, keeping the legend alive. Yet, even in this era of conflict, we find clear signs that the Germanic kingdoms saw themselves not as Rome's destroyers, but as its successors. Many of these kingdoms viewed themselves as equal to the Roman Empire, rather than mere invaders. This idea is reinforced by historical tradition. When Theodoric the Great set out to conquer Italy, he did not act as a barbarian warlord seizing Roman lands. Instead, he sought the blessing of Emperor Zeno, a move that underscored his desire for legitimacy as part of Rome's legacy, rather than its downfall. The Western country long ago governed by the rule of your ancestors and predecessors, and that city which was the head and mistress of the world, wherefore it is now shaken by the tyranny of the Torquilingi and the Rugi. Send me there with my race. Thus, if you but say the word, you may be freed from the burden of expense here. And if, by the Lord's help, I shall conquer, the fame of your piety shall be glorious there. For it is better that I, your servant and your son, should rule that kingdom, receiving it as a gift from you if I conquer, than that one whom you do not recognize should oppress your senate with his tyrannical yoke, and a part of the republic with slavery. For if I prevail, I shall retain it as your grant and gift. If I am conquered, your piety will lose nothing, nay, as I have said, it will save the expense, I know a tale. All of this suggests that the fall of the Western Roman Empire wasn't perceived as a catastrophic collapse at the time. Instead, it was more a rapid shift in power, one that the average person likely barely noticed. There was no massive, all-encompassing invasion. Roman territories never saw the kind of large-scale Germanic onslaught often imagined. In fact, the Goths remained a small but powerful minority in the regions like Italy and Spain. Their ability to establish kingdoms on Roman soil depended not on brute force alone, but on the willingness of the local population to accept their rule. Without their tolerance, their reign would have been impossible. But before we move forward, let's return to Prisco's account, because within it lies a fascinating story, one that might completely change your perspective on Rome's so-called collapse. As I waited and walked up and down in front of the enclosure which surrounded the house, a man whom from his Scythian dress I took for a barbarian came up and addressed me in Greek with the word chaire, hail. I was surprised at a Scythian speaking Greek. Then he smiled and said that he was born a Greek and had gone as a merchant to Viminacium on the Danube, where he had stayed a long time, married a very rich wife. But the city fell prey to the barbarians and he was stripped of his prosperity, and on account of his riches was allotted to Negesius in the division of the spoil, as it was the custom among the Scythians for the chiefs to reserve for themselves the rich prisoners. Having fought bravely against the Romans and the Akatiri, he had paid the spoils he won to his master, and so obtained freedom. He then married a barbarian wife and had children, and had the privilege of eating on the table of Onegesius. He considered his new life among the Scythians better than his old life among the Romans, and the reason he gave were as follows. After a war, the Scythians live in inactivity, enjoying what they have got, and not at all, or very little harassed. The Romans, on the other hand, are in the first place very liable to perish in war, as they have to rest their hopes of safety on others, and are not allowed on account of their tyrants to use arms. Priscus recounts an intriguing encounter. He meets a man who had willingly joined the Huns. This man embraced the Hunnic ranks because they offered him greater freedom in return for his service, a motivation that might also explain why the Germanic elite were so readily accepted within the Western Roman Empire. Perhaps a similar phenomenon occurred in the Bronze Age. Remember, the collapse of these empires is told almost entirely through the voices of the elite. The commoners left no inscriptions, their experience unrecorded. These empires were built from the top down, with ordinary people treated merely as a resource. Yet when the palaces crumbled, many found themselves, if only slightly, liberated from a lifetime of grueling labor and massive construction projects, or the constant exploitation by greedy officials. Greece offers a striking example of this transformation. After the fall of the Mycenaeans, a new civilization slowly emerged from the ruins of their grand palaces. It took centuries to fully develop, but eventually, this culture would become one of the most influential in history. Its poetry, art, architecture, and legendary heroes continue to inspire and captivate us today, unlike the enigmatic Mycenaeans themselves, whose very existence is shrouded in mystery. Similarly, the fall of the Roman Empire was not an abrupt, catastrophic collapse, but an inevitable transformation. Although it took hundreds of years, something new eventually rose from Rome's ashes. A fresh culture would emerge that would not only dominate its own continent, but also leave an indelible mark on the entire world. Empires fall as a part of a natural cycle of change, and often from that very change, something even greater is born.